so we're going to start talking today about the other kind of transistor, and other kind of transistor, namely the CMOS variety, or sorry, the Mosfet variety. And so I started a second version of the notes, and I need to condense it with all the stuff in the first version and get that posted for you guys, but I'll just put it up here for now. So to kind of go back, the type of transistors that we've used thus far were bipolar junction transistors. And we only used the NPNs. We didn't use any of the PNPs. We could have. The PNPs work sort of opposite of the NPN, namely you apply current to turn them off rather than to turn them on, like the NPNs. So they sort of work in an inverted fashion. Yeah, okay. So we're going to start looking at the MOSFET transistors, which in some sense function similar, okay, and in other senses are very different. They're very different in the sense of like how the physics actually works internally to them. But in terms of how it appears to function to the user, it's similar, right? In that they're basically switches. Okay, so there's two types of these, N channel and P channel, okay, or Nmos and Pmos for short, and they're going to work similar to how the BJTs worked in that the Nmos you apply voltage to turn it on. The PMOS, you apply voltage to turn it off. Okay, so it's just a matter of whether or not it's default off or on. Okay, so a little bit of the history here. Well, actually, before I get to that, so the part numbers for our NMOSs are 2N7000s, and the label for what each of the pins are, they have different names in the BJTs. So we have a source, a gate, and a drain. And what's annoying, at least that as far as I can tell, is it's not the case that the pins are always where you expect them to be. It depends on the manufacturer. So this morning we wired stuff up and we're like, why is it not working? Well, it turned out that I had read the data sheet wrong and thought the drain was the source and the source was the drain, and nothing worked. Okay, so anyway, the gate usually is the middle pin, and it functions kind of the same way that the base did when we were working with the BJTs. Different than the BJTs, though, we don't have to put a resistor in front of it, which is kind of nice. We don't, that reduces a part. And the way that this works is if the voltage difference between the gate and the source is roughly 2 volts, then it switches sort of to on. When you're right around that 2 volts, you can kind of have weird behavior. But the good news is we don't have to worry about that because the Arduino, all those pins are 5-volt pins. And 5 volts is way above 2 volts, so things will work quite nicely. And the PMOS, it's sort of the same thing, except it turns it off instead of on. Okay, so the manufacturing for these things, in terms of their use in integrated circuits, early on, the PMOS processors, or stuff made with PMOS, was better. And so, for example, the first commercial microprocessor, does anybody happen to know what it was? The very first one? Intel made it. Nope. It was the Intel 4004, okay, which they released in, I think it was 1971. And they designed and built it it and some auxiliary chips to go with it, in partnership with a Japanese company called Busicom. They wanted to make an electronic calculator and needed a processor for that, and so they partnered with Intel. Yeah.
So for the NMOS and the PMOS, drain and
Sort of, yes. But so the drain and the source are flipped, um, but not necessarily which pins they're on. That depends on who makes it, right? And so that actually is I need to update this in the notes because we had one of them backwards this morning and things didn't work right. Okay, so yeah, basically with these, the TLDR is look at the data sheet and do what the data sheet says. And I'll show you actually the data sheets for both of these parts later, show you kind of how to read these things. So yeah. Um, but believe it or not, actually, the Intel 4004 was not the first microprocessor. It's just that nobody knew about the other one at the time because guess what? It was classified. And it was developed for the F-14 for the flight computer on that, and as such, it was highly classified. And it wasn't until like in the 90s that anybody realized, once that information became unclassified, that actually Intel's processor wasn't the first. It's just that nobody else could say anything about it, or else they'd have to, get shot. So yeah. Anyway, um, so of course you guys know what the F-14 was, right? Or is, I guess. Tomcat from Top Gun. Yeah. Now I just want to like put on Danger Zone and while we're wiring up transistors. Okay. Anyway, so anyway, the early the 4004 used PMOS only, and it's fine. And then later in the later 70s and very early 80s, the Nmos stuff was better. And so there were several processors that used Nmos only. Notably, a notable example is the 6502 processor, which powered Commodore 64, Apple II, uh, the original Atari, and the 8-bit Nintendo. Right. So very. Oh, and did anybody have a Tamagotchi when you were a little kid? Did any of your sisters have Tamagotchis? Do you guys even know what Tamagotchis are? What are they? Yeah, exactly. It's like about the size of a watch, and it's like a little pet, and you have to feed it and take care of it and stuff. And if you don't, it will die, and then have to start over with a new one. These were all the rage in the 90s, but guess what processor they used? The 6502. Okay. So those were purely NMOS processors. But in the mid-ish 80s, um, both of the fabrication techniques were uh, sufficiently developed that you could put both on a chip. And that enabled something really cool called CMOS, or complementary uh, MOS for short, where you build all your circuits not using just NMOS or PMOS, but using both of them in a very clever complementary way. And the idea for this is actually very old. It's from the early '60s. In fact, I even found the original patent document for it from 1963, I think it was. Um, but in terms of like manufacturing stuff this way, it wasn't really possible. Okay, so here's the very first circuit we're going to build. Okay, which is a CMOS inverter. So the schematic. If we were to build this, so make sure you got an empty breadboard. And what parts do we need to do this? Okay, just looking at the schematic here. Okay, so what parts? So what's this one? The 2N7000. That's our Nmos, okay? So those are in the bags, and I think I labeled them FET and then N for field effect transistor, and then the N type. I really should have labeled them all Nmos. I don't know what I was thinking that day. Okay, so you'll need one Nmos and one Pmos, okay? Now, be very careful because they look identical. How do you tell which one's which? Yeah, the numbering on them, which is very difficult to read. So yeah, just be careful not to mix them up. Okay, and you'll know that you've mixed them up because things won't work right. But yeah. Okay, so we need one Nmos and one Pmos. And then it's not in the schematic, but how are we going to see what the output is? Yeah, like what would be a good indicator for the output? Yeah, let's use a light. Okay, so pick an LED. And then what else do you need to go with an LED? A 330 ohm resistor. So in this case, that's the only resistor that we need. We don't have to put one on the inputs, which is kind of nice. Okay, so a 330 ohm resistor for the LED is sufficient, and the two transistors and then a bunch of wire is all we need. Okay. Okay, so in the diagram here, and generally in the rest of the diagrams that are going to follow, I've got sort of I'm thinking of the circuit in two parts. There's the stuff towards the plus 5 volt side and the stuff towards the ground side. Now, how you lay this out on your breadboard, well, that's up to you, right? Because I could put the power and the ground kind of wherever I want. But I'm going to think of it as I've got plus 5 volts, I've got my ground, and then the PMOS stuff will go on the plus 5 volt side, and the NMOS stuff will go on the ground side, and the output will be somewhere in the middle. Okay, so in this case, our input, you can use just pin 2 or whatever off the Arduino. Okay, and then the output will go to your LED, and then to the resistor, and then to ground. Okay, and make sure which way do you plug in the LED? The long side is on which side of the circuit? The positive side. So the short leg is the one that should be then connected through the resistor to ground. Okay. Okay. So the schematic then, what's the only other thing we need to worry about from the schematic? How do we know which pin's which on the transistors? Okay, so flat facing forward towards you. 1 is on the left, 2 is in the middle, and 3 is on the right. Okay, so you'll notice in the diagram there's a 1, 2, and 3. Isn't that awesome? Yeah, okay, because it makes it easy to know what should be connected to what. Okay, so while you're wiring this up, let's sort of talk about how it should work. Okay, the NMOS works a lot like the NPN, meaning how do we turn it on? You apply voltage to it, okay? And you turn it off by not applying voltage or by having ground basically connected. The PMOS is the exact opposite. So how do we turn on a PMOS? We don't apply voltage. And how do we turn a PMOS off? You do apply voltage. Okay, so let's suppose that the input, we're applying 5 volts to it. Okay, what's going to happen to the PMOS? It's going to turn off. What's going to happen to the NMOS? It'll turn on. What that means is the output. Is the output connected to ground or 5 volts? If this one is on and that one is off, it'll be connected to ground. Okay, so being connected to ground means you're at low voltage, and what do we call that? What's another way of saying low? Off. Okay, so in the situation that the input is high or on, what's the output? Low or off. Okay, does that make sense, though, why it should be that way? Okay, so what is this circuit doing? It's doing the exact opposite of the input. Okay, so this is an inverter circuit. All right, now on the flip side, let's suppose that the input now is low or off. Okay, if the input is off, what happens to the Nmos transistor? It's off, but what's the Pmos? And so now the output is connected to plus 5 volts, which is high or on. Okay, so you guys see how it does the exact opposite of the input? Okay. So, or at least that's how it should work. Okay. So let me demonstrate this. So let me come over to the camera and get it somewhat focused. Okay, so I've got my version of it here. Okay, and it's a little hard to see because, of course, you need a lot of wires to make this work. But I've got my PMOS here and my Nmos to the right of it. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take pin 2, this wire, so I removed it from the Arduino. Okay, and if I connect this input to ground, okay, what is the light doing? Staying on. So my input is off, but my output is on, right? Okay, so it's the opposite of my input. If I connect this pin to plus 5 volts, what happens? Turns off, okay? So this circuit is the output's the opposite of its input, and that's why we call it an inverter or a NOT gate. Okay, so I realize that this is kind of a messy, right? There's a lot of wires going on here, but the salient points are, when I wired this, here's how I did it. I put my 2 transistors in, and then I just looked at, okay, what should be connected to pin 1, what should be connected to pin 2, what should be connected to pin 3, and so on until I was finished. Okay? So, make sense? Now, yours may look slightly different, and that's okay, depending on how you choose to lay everything out. Okay, but put your 2 transistors in, okay, and then put your LED kind of over onto the side, and then just be like, okay, for the first transistor, what needs to be connected to pin 1? 5 volts. What to pin 2? Your input, okay, which is coming from the Arduino. What to pin 3? Go over to your output, okay, wherever you're going to put that. And then do the same thing for the other transistor. Okay, so does that make sense? Okay, so allez-y, right? Oh, and actually, let me show you one other maybe easier thing to do with the. So let me show you the output part. What I did was I took a wire from each output and kind of moved them over to the right, and then I could put the LED over there and just keep everything straight. So, yeah, and I don't think I was particularly good at color coding here. No, actually I did. Okay, so my 2 yellow wires here are coming from my outputs, which it turns out for both transistors is pin 3. Okay? All right, so carry on, get wiring. Okay, and yours, it may look different if you wired it up different. So, okay, so which transistor is this? The PMOS or the NMOS? Okay, so 5 volts needs to be connected to the, which pin is it? Let me get back to the diagram. To pin 1, which is the left-hand pin. Okay, so So you've got 5 volts here. I'm going to move your ground. Oh, no, that's fine. We'll just leave it where it is. Okay. So then you've got this coming over to your output, and then pin 2 is, so here, get out some breadboard, more wire. We're going to connect to the input. Yeah, the gate, right? So you've got your ground here on the blue side, and then so we'll put a wire from pin 2 to the red side. Okay. And then you've got from that to the gate. Okay. And then, all right, so this transistor is finished because you've got this wire going over to where the outputs are going to be. Now let's do that one. So that's the Nmos one. So pin 1 should be connected to where?
Is it reversed or is it still pin 1?
Pin 1 is always on the left. Right. So pin 1 to ground. Okay. So the bottom one, yeah. So pin 1 is the one connected to ground. And so ground you put on the blue side there, right? So pin 1 is to the left to there, right? Okay, so pin 1 to ground. Pin 2 to your input, which you had on the red rail. And then pin 3 will go over to the output.
Which one is by which side of
So the input is going to connect to pin 2 on both onto the gates, okay? And then the pin 3, which is the drain for one of them and the source for the other, is going to connect over to our outputs, to your input, which is the red rail. Yeah, because that's our input to the circuit, right? And then the other one goes over here to your output. So connect there to there, 1 over.
Here?
Uh-huh. Okay, then long side on there, and then do the resistor to ground. Okay, so where is ground? So in this case, because you've got all these wires, let's just scoot this there and get one wire to go from here to ground. Does that make sense? Yeah. The blue, you put ground on the blue one, yeah. Okay. All right, so let's see.
I'm not confused on how you plug everything in.
Well, so first off, where are the 2 transistors? Okay, which one's which? Okay, so you got your PMOS here, your NMOS there, and we'll do the lights there. Okay, then you've got pin 2 and 4. For this circuit, we don't need pin 4, but that's okay, just leave it. And then you've got your plus 5 volts and your ground, and then pin 2 here. Okay, so look at the diagram. The PMOS transistor is the one at the top. That's the left-hand one. Okay, what's connected to pin 1 of the PMOS? 5 volts. Okay, so put a wire to connect 5 volts to pin 1. Okay, and you know which pin is which because it's always 1, 2, 3 with the flat side facing you. Okay, so there's one pin down. Pin 2 needs to be connected to the input, which is the green or the rail there, right? That's coming from pin 2 on the Arduino. And it's coincidence that they're both pin 2, right? Okay, so 2 pins down, and pin 3 is connected to, right, so wire it over to the long side of the of your LED. I'm sorry, one side there, okay, which is the left-hand one, the way I put it in.
Okay, so we're just trying to copy that.
Your laying that out, right? For the LED. So,
What are the numbers?
oh, so the unit of resistance is called the ohm, and the higher the number, the higher the resistance. Okay, so the way you know which resistors to use for an LED, basically just always use a 330. Okay, and the other ones, actually, in this case, we don't need anything beyond that, and it's only because we need it for the LED. So the other way that you know is, so there's an equation that relates voltage, current, and resistance. And so we know that the voltage is 5 volts, and if we know, okay, how much current a device can take, we can choose the resistance by solving this equation, okay? And if the resistance is 0, then, which is, that never is true, right? But if the resistance is very, very, very tiny, then that basically means the current is giant, and that'll burn out the LED. So if we didn't put a resistor in there, it would burn out and release the magic purple smoke, and the room would smell funny for about 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah, they spend a lot of time and effort in the factories to get the purple smoke into the devices, and so, yeah, okay. All right, so then do the exact same thing on the other transistor. Do pin 1, do pin 2, do pin 3. Yeah, you can go ahead and leave it because we'll need it in a minute, but yeah. Okay, so that's because the light is not finished, right? So you've got the positive side connected to the outputs, but the negative side has to be connected to ground because otherwise there's no circuit. Oh, no, resistor. Okay, 330, connect the short end to ground.
We're not sure.
Okay, so yeah, this should be, so this is not actually connected to anything, right? It should be this one, this side. And then let's double check okay, so the long one comes from the outputs, and then this goes to, oh, sorry, I've got this wrong. The short side should go to ground, which you have, where's ground? The orange wire? Or
Orange.
okay, so the orange one is on the top, the blue part, so then this should go from here to there. Okay, and then it's going on and off because of the input from the pin. So if we take this and connect it, short it to ground, our input is off, but our output is on. And if we short this to 5 volts, our input is on, but our output is off. So it's the opposite. And then if we just plug back into pin 2, then the program will just sort of alternate. Okay. Okay, so do we have Das Blinken liegt? No problems? Okay. Did you guys get it or not done yet? Not done yet? But is it making sense? Just do it. Okay, let's see. So you've got plus 5 volts is the red one, and ground is the yellow one. Okay, so the first transistor is your PMOS, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and so pin 1 should be connected to plus 5 volts. Pin 2 to what will be our input.
Yep.
Pin 3 to the output, which let's just scoot it over there. Okay. All right, the other transistor, the NMOS, pin 1 to ground, pin 2 to the gate, and pin 3 to the output. So the only reason I'm doing this extra wire for the output is just to make it a little easier to see where the output is. Okay, so far so good. The only things we still need is a wire to go from pin 2 on the Arduino to the blue rail. And then we also need our light so we can see what's going on. Okay, so go ahead and put the light in. Which side should the long side be? Okay, so actually put it here, and then you won't need another wire. So the wires are on the positive side, and the short leg needs to go to ground. And where did you put ground? On the blue rail. Okay. Okay, so now the reason that it's turning on is because right now there's no input, which is to say the input is low. But if we connect one wire from here to pin 2, now it's going to alternate based on pin 2. And it's going to do exactly the opposite of what pin 2 is doing, because that's what this circuit does. It's an inverter. Okay. All right, so it looks like we've got some good circuits. They're working. No, you all fail. All right, so let's take a peek. It's because you have a short circuit, gentlemen. Where's ground? This one?
Ground's all the way on the...
Okay, so this should go from here to ground. And the LED's backwards. Okay, so this is what we had happening this morning, okay, and it turned out that, okay, so you have plus 5 volts here on the top, right, and then your signal, the input from the, okay, so the negative side, okay, so this is your PMOS, yes, okay, so your PMOS you've got backwards,
plus having them look at that just told me to switch it.
Yeah, plus 5 volts should go to pin 1. Okay, so exactly, like this is how I knew there was something wrong, because we wired it up like you had it just before I switched it earlier this morning, and we're like, and I'm like, why is this not working? This should be working. So we switched them, and then I looked back at the data sheet and realized I was an idiot and misread it, right? So it happens. Okay, so you're good. All right.
Look, when we do this, it turns on. But when you put it in, it doesn't.
Okay, so that's because you've got things backwards. Okay, so which one is your PMOS and which one is your NMOS?
P's on the left.
Okay,
right?
So.
Wait, is the top one P?
Yes.
Then yeah, it's on the left.
Okay, so you've got the PMOS. Oh, this is all kinds of messed up, guys. Okay.
The light turned on though.
Well.
That's the positive side.
Okay, so let's put plus 5 volts there, ground there. Okay, so.
Oh boy. Oh wow.
Okay.
Okay, so this is ground.
That's ground, and then I'm going to put pin 2 over here. Okay. On the PMOS, what's connected to pin 1?
5 volts.
5 volts. Where is 5 volts? 5
Positive.
volts
Right, negative.
is
Positive.
okay. The black one. Okay, so plus 5 volts to pin 1. Okay. What's connected to pin 2? The input, which is the orange wire over here. So that's connected to our gate. Well,
Here's the output, which is
goes over to the LED.
light.
Okay, so we got that. All right, 3 is the output. So we go over to the positive side of the light. Okay, now it's going to do stuff, but we're not done yet, obviously, right? Okay, now that's it for this transistor. Now go over to this one. What's connected to pin 1? Ground. Okay, so pin 1 to ground.
Ground is white.
Okay, pin 2.
Wait, is it?
Is it not reversed on this one?
What sort of? So what pin 1? So notice that pin 1 on the NMOS is connected to ground, whereas pin 1 on the PMOS was connected to plus 5 volts, right? Yep, and 3 is the output. So that's actually nice. Yes, the positive side. Yep. Okay, so there it goes. It works. And how we know is if we take this and we short it to ground, that's at 0 input, 1 output. But if I put this on plus 5 volts, it turns off. So, so it's an inverter.
If it's in there, then it flashes?
Because the program, the Arduino, is turning the pin on and off every second. Yeah. Okay, looks good. So right now we're not using pin 4. You can leave it connected, but yeah, okay. Yeah, so we'll use pin 4 in a minute. Okay, so the way you check is, okay, this resistor, where is ground? You've got ground, the white one? Okay, so this resistor should be going to, from this to ground. No. Ground is, it's labeled on there, literally ground, right? Okay, so how we'll know this is working is if we take this wire here, which is the pin 2, if I connect this to ground, that means that the input is 0, the output is 1, whereas if I switch this to being plus 5 volts, the input is on, but the output is off. And then I'll just put it back here on pin 2 so that it can alternate with our program. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so looks like everybody's got it working. And, you know, this isn't rocket science, but you do have to kind of be careful. Make sure, just go in order. What is pin 1 connected to? Connect it. What's pin 2? Connect it. Pin 3? Connect it. And so on. Okay, and pay attention. And don't be dumbasses, please. Okay, so what was the behavior that we observed here? This inverted the input. It did exactly the opposite of the input that came in. Okay, so we built one of these with an NPN, a single NPN last time. Okay, but the reason that this is called CMOS is because we have this complementary pair. Okay, and the complement part, which is what I think is so beautiful here, is not necessarily apparent right now, but it will be in just a minute. Okay, so last time when we wired up, first we did an inverter, and then we turned it into a NAND gate by adding a second transistor, right? We're going to add in another pair of transistors. Okay, so let me show you this diagram. Okay, so what I'd suggest you do is just start over for this so that you can space things out nicely, okay? But what else do you need for this circuit? You need one more Nmos and one more Pmos, okay? So the other thing I would do is put the Pmos's together kind of close to each other, put the Nmos's together kind of close to each other, and leave a little bit of space between the Pmos's and the Nmos's, and then more space over to the LED, okay? So, and then of course you're going to need extra wire, but that's about it. Okay, so let's talk, before you get wiring, what's going to happen with this circuit, assuming that, okay, we now have 2 inputs, okay, instead of just one. And so this is why plug one of them into pin 2 and the other one into pin 4, that like we've done before, okay? And then the program on the Arduino is going to alternate them on and off for us so we can kind of see the pattern. Okay, so let's assume that both inputs are low. Okay, so input A is low and input B is low. What's going to happen? Well, let's start on the PMOS side. If both inputs are low, what's true about both PMOSs? They're on, okay? Which means the output is connected, how? What is it connected to, ground or 5 volts? It is connected to 5 volts, okay? Now, what about if one of the inputs is on but the other one is not? It's still connected to 5 volts, right? So let's say that input A is on and input B is off. This transistor is off because it does the opposite of its input. And if input B is off, then this transistor is on. There's a path between plus 5 volts and the output. So the output would be on. Okay, so if either of the inputs or potentially both are off, then the output is on. Okay, so what's the case that we need to consider still? What about if both inputs are on? Okay, if both inputs are on, what happens to the two PMOS transistors? They turn off. Okay, on the NMOS side, what happens if both inputs are off? Then on. Then what are the two NMOSs? On. So is there a path from ground to output? Yes. Okay, and so that output would read low or 0. Okay, what kind of circuit is this? I mean, it says on there, it's a NAND gate. It's not AND, okay? So if we look at the truth table for it, which I've got down here, there's our truth table, right? So what's the only situation that the light is on? When both inputs are off, okay? And otherwise, the output is off, okay? And do you guys agree that this is the opposite of an AND gate? Okay, so let's say I wanted to build an AND gate. How would I have to do it with this kind of scheme? I'd build a NAND gate, and then I would take its output and use that as the input for an inverter. Okay, so I would invert the right? Not and is just and. Okay, now you can imagine that this is starting to get a little complicated, because how many transistors would that take? 6. Okay, 4 for the NAND and 2 for the inverter, right? So 3 of each type. Okay, that's a lot, but it's not really all that many. Okay, all right, so let's go back up to the schematic while you guys wire this up. Okay, and what should you see when all's said and done? On for 1 second and off for 3. Okay, yes? Okay, so get to wiring. And again, just go one transistor at a time, do each pin at one at a time, and if you kind of are systematic about it, then this isn't really that terrible. Okay. I would go ahead and just start with a clean breadboard. Yeah, just so you can space things out nicely. It probably is easier. Okay. Now the last thing I want you to notice is, and this is why it's called complementary. How are the two PMOS transistors arranged, sort of electrically? They are in parallel, right? What about the two NMOSs? They're in series. Okay, so the way this works is anytime you have if one thing is in parallel, its complementary pieces are in the equivalent series arrangement, and vice versa. Okay, and yeah, that's the brilliant part of this. Okay, so the PMOSs, how do I know that these ones at the top are PMOSs, by the way? There's several ways. Okay, they have a P in the part name. You'll notice the arrow is pointing in, whereas the other one, it's pointing out. And then the part numbers are different, right? And the software I've used to make this, by the way, is free. It's called KiCad, K-I-C-A-D. But it's kind of complicated, so. Okay. All right, so get to wiring, and hopefully we'll start to see some NAND gates, and I'll be a happy panda. Yeah. Yes. Well, all 4, right? Because that way you won't get confused as to where's where. Yes.
So one of the 2 pins has to go to the negative, and then the other has to go to positive. So like pin 2 can go to negative, and pin 4 can go to.
That's fine.
Positive.
Yeah.
Or do they both have to be on?
It doesn't matter. Okay. So the things that are labeled plus and minus they're just labels.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was trying to for the wiring whether they all needed both the pins need to be on the negative strip or.
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
So what I like to do personally is do power ground
Okay.
on this rail,
Okay.
and then my 2 inputs down on that rail, or vice versa.
Okay.
It doesn't matter, but just pick something and stay consistent, and then you won't confuse yourself. Okay. Yeah. Okay, this making sense, guys? We're just a matter of doing it. Oh, I see. Okay, so which one's your P? Is this the P from before? Okay, so this is a PMOS though. Okay, so put the other one. This is still a PMOS. Yeah, just close to it, but not in line with it. So, and maybe leave a couple of columns of space just so that it's easier to get the wires in. But it doesn't really matter as long as it's not in line with the other ones, right? And so what I'd do here is I'd maybe take your output and scoot it way the heck over there. So you've got P, P, N, N, and then you've got, things are nicely spaced so you can kind of see what you're doing. Right? Does that make sense? And don't forget when you get to the output to get the resistor in there, because otherwise you'll burn out the LED. 330. Yeah. Yeah, basically for LEDs, just always a 330. And we'd use a 220 if we were using 3.3 volts instead of 5 volts. But yeah, we it doesn't need much resistance. And if we use one that's too big, it'll just be really dim, or you won't see it at all. So like if you put too big of a resistor, like it might be on technically, but you won't be able to see it. It's so weak. Okay. Is it making sense? Yeah? Okay. All right. So we've only got a couple minutes left today. So let's just kind of recap briefly. When you're all done with this, what should you see? On for 1, off for 3. Okay. Now, what we could add into this, okay, what about if we added in 2 more LEDs and 2 more resistors? Okay, where would we want to put those? Well, what about if we go from pin 2, so one of our inputs, through an LED, through a resistor to ground, and then the second one from pin 4 through the LED, through the resistor to ground. What would that let us see? It let us see both inputs blinking also in addition to the output. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Because right now we really don't know which input is on when, other than knowing that we're in that 4-second pattern. Okay. All right. The last thing I want to show you guys is, let me scroll down to my notes here. Okay. All right. Don't look at this diagram if you're wiring still. Okay. So don't wire what I'm got up now. What did I change here? It's almost the exact same circuit, except I put the PMOSs in series and the NMOSs in parallel. Okay. And guess what kind of gate this one is? It's a NOR gate. Okay. So it's not OR. If I wanted to build an OR gate, what would I do? I would use the output of this and go into an inverter. Okay, so hence we could build NAND, NOR, NOT, and an OR. And the only 2 that are left are XOR and therefore NXOR by just throwing an extra inverter on it. Okay, so You see, this is why it's called CMOS, the complement part. Thing in series, complementary piece in parallel, right? And if the thing in series are P's, the thing in parallels are N's, and vice versa, okay? And you guys maybe have noticed that there's this complement, this like pairing arrangement is, there's actually a very good logical reason for it, okay, which we'll talk about more, I guess, starting Wednesday. Okay, so, make sense? All right, so what I would like you guys to have done and working before you come to class Wednesday is a NAND gate with 3 LEDs, okay? What are 2 of the LEDs going to do? Just show you what the inputs are, okay? So one on one input, one on the other. That way you know which input's which. And then what's your third LED? The output, okay? Which should be 3 seconds on, 1 second off. And when is it going to be on? Only when both of the other 2 lights are off, okay? When either or both of the other lights are on, your output should be off, right? And that's how you know that this actually is a NAND gate, okay, when you see it. Okay, does that make sense? Yes? Okay, so go ahead and clean up, and we'll see you on Wednesday.